Like any good science fiction universe, Star Wars does its best to explore the weird and wacky world of xenoanthropology, or in layman's terms, how many different ways one can make an alien species. Like many others, Star Wars hits many of the usual tropes, like the genius mathematicians or the fuzzy giants. Today, however, we're going to be focusing on a different category of aliens we're particularly not fond of: Hive-Mind societies. So what is a hive-mind? A quick Google search will tell you that a hive-mind is a collective consciousness in which a group of people become aware of their commonality and think and act as a community, sharing their knowledge, thoughts, and resources. In science fiction, the term refers to a species whose consciousness is a collective whole. In other words, there are no individuals, but each body is connected to one giant mind, sharing thoughts, feelings, and knowledge instantaneously. The species we'll be looking at today are nothing like many of those you're familiar with. In fact, we'd bet our editor's left kidney you haven't heard of most of these species before. Without further ado, let's look at some hive minds.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Before we get started on some of the more developed hive-minded species, we're going to take a look at 4 that haven't received as much back development as the other entries on this list. For every Billa, Killick, or Nautilin, there are always 10 species you know significantly less about, and that's where we're at with these 4 species: the Tazaki, the Vorclaws, the Karan, and the Ivarema. The Tazaki were a species of sentient insectoids who all shared a collective consciousness in the form of a hive mind, and that's pretty much everything we know about them. We know they weren't very opposed to the idea of slavery, which Qui-Gon Jinn guessed might be related to their language. In the Tazaki language, the word for freedom was synonymous with having no purpose, so Qui-Gon theorized that, in their eyes, the opposite of freedom, aka slavery, would mean someone had a purpose in life. The Vorclaw were another insectoid species native to the planet Madrias. Standing at an average of 2 meters, these large creatures were protected by large chitinous shells that covered their bodies. As omnivores, they consumed both animal and plant matter to survive, living underground in tunnels. They were classified as semi-sentient species, as they lacked intelligence as individuals, but once linked together in colony-wide hive minds, they achieved a little more sentience. Their species was almost made extinct when, in 4999 BBY, a Sith Lord by the name of Vitiate arrived on the planet and performed the Ritual of Nathema, a ritual which granted him immortality by stripping the living force from the entire planet. Madrias was transformed into a barren desert as a result, but some Vorclaw escaped with their lives by being deep underground. The hive mind, however, was destroyed by the ritual, leaving their colonies as nothing more than groups of mindless animals. Driven by hunger, the Vorclaw were eventually forced out onto the planet's surface, where radiation from Nathema's sun burned them horrifically. With nothing else left alive on the planet, they were eventually driven to mindless cannibalism in order to survive, until their numbers dwindled. The few remaining survivors were eventually captured by Vitiate and sealed in carbonite. He would use them as guards over the next millennia whenever he had need of them, making for a sorry end to an otherwise interesting species. The Karans, on the other hand, were mammalian in nature. They were built to be large and slow, and their diet consisted mainly of vegetation and insects. Their bodies were shaped roughly like a cone, with the narrow snout widening out to thick thighs and juicy booty. Their hands had 4 fingers ending in long claws that served as defensive weapons. They also lacked opposable thumbs. As a general rule, they could speak Basic, as taught by settlers on their world, but they were known to speak with an odd accent. Now, as for their hive mind, they were what we might call almost a proper hive mind. What this means in the Karen's case was that, although they did exist as individuals, their individual thoughts and consciousness could be suppressed into that of the community mind. So in other words, we'd call them selectively hive-minded. By the time of the Galactic Civil War, they were still developing Stone Age era technology, such as using wooden tools and clay pottery. Using clay, they also constructed their villages, which were built as circles of clay huts. In the center of this circle lay the common areas as well as the chief's hut. To build these structures, they relied on sun-dried bricks of clay and packed grass, which they could find in abundance in the areas surrounding their home. At the same time, it helped the Karen villagers blend in with their surroundings. For food, they grew a crop known as a tuber, which was the main staple of their diets. They also used the grasses from the grasslands surrounding their villages to weave into cloth, although they wore no clothing. They decorated their fur with clay for special occasions, and we also know they played a game called Solly that involved 3 brightly coloured balls of different sizes. Finally, as far as their religion and spirituality went, we know that they didn't fear death. Karen warriors fought for their homes and the future of the collective, so individual deaths weren't important in the slightest. This mentality also allowed the Karens to sacrifice themselves without hesitation for the greater good. The final hive-minded species we don't know too much about were the Yvarema, a bipedal species of sapients native to Yvara, a planet near the Cathol Rift in the Outer Rim. These sapients were a hive-minded species segregated into classes that were completely dependent on one another. The species was ruled by the Majvara, the monarch and progenitor of the entire species. Before they developed technology, the Majvara laid her eggs in a specialized chamber. From these eggs emerged the various Yvarema classes that made up their society. By 8 ABY, they'd evolved to produce embryonic cells instead of eggs that were then matured in incubators. Their hive mind worked in a combination of pheromones and empathetic links. Unlike many other similar species, each member retained their unique individuality and personality. However, similarly to the Billars, whom we'll talk about later, their intelligence was based off how many of them were congregated in an area. The more members, the smarter they all were collectively. Their hive mind also transmitted emotions, however, which could cause problems if the entire group became totally overwhelmed. To avoid that, some classes were bred to be less sensitive to negative emotions. This emotional link could extend to members of other species, but on a much more limited scale. The majority of what we know about this species focuses on the different classes that made up their society, each one of which played a distinct role. The lowest class was the worker Yvarema. Members of this class were of neutral sex and physically strong, trained to fulfill a multitude of physical jobs such as construction, maintenance, and sanitation. The explorer scouts were more nimble than the workers and were most distinct for the water and fat retaining hump on their back, similar to what a camel has. This class was tasked with patrolling the regions beyond the hive's territory, searching for food, water, and other resources. They were also tasked with protecting the hive from predators they encountered during these patrols. To facilitate their work, their empathetic senses were stronger than that of the other classes, allowing them to remain connected with the hive even at greater distances. They also had superior night vision, as well as decreased tactile sense, so any danger that found them wouldn't then go on to endanger the hive. The third class was known as the Lore Gatherers, which were also the longest lived Yvarema after the Majvara. This class was responsible for maintaining libraries and archives. As the scholars of the hive, they had enlarged craniums to allow for larger brain development. Bigger brains came with heightened empathetic senses, which in turn meant they had to seal themselves away from the hive by default until they were needed for something, as their heightened empathy left them vulnerable to the pain and danger the first 2 classes experienced daily. The Royal Explorers were a class similar to the Explorer Scouts, but intended for deep space exploration. There were only ever 12 of this class at a time, and they were bred to have stronger personalities and some limited intelligence. As you'll recall, the way their hive mind worked is, the more Yvarema there were, the smarter they would be. As a consequence, a lone member of the species was duller than a Geonosian boulder. To prevent the Royal Explorers from eating space glue while out on assignment, they were accompanied by 1 lore gatherer, 3 workers to do any manual labor, and 2 explorer scouts. This group was supposed to remain within 100 kilometers of each other at all times, but if the Royal Explorer was accidentally separated, they could survive thanks to the limited intelligence bred into them. And finally, the last class of Yvarema were the Far Star Warriors, which were bred for the first time in 8 ABY. This group of warriors was a response to the unwanted hostility from the Quektoth Confederation, which attacked the hive around that time. However, Creating them took a heavy toll on the Majvara, reducing her lifespan. The next species we're going to talk about received a lot more attention from the Star Wars writers, although some might argue they weren't blessed with many good attributes. Much like the Karens and the Ivarema, the next species we'll be talking about is also not an insectoid species, despite the most common Hive-Mind stereotype. Created for the sourcebook Galaxy Guide 4 Alien Races, the Billars were a sentient primate species native to Mima 2, a tectonically active but incredibly lush world in the western reaches of the Mid-Rim. Billars were fairly small, standing at little over a meter tall. We'd compare them to a Care Bear with their rounded ears and short muzzle, if Care Bears were pink and naked like a Sphinx cat. Much like the primates of our world, they could waddle about on their hind legs, drop to all fours, or swing through the trees. Their hairless skin allowed for quick heat transfer, and thanks to the lush jungles of their homeworld, they didn't have to worry about sunburn. Billars were unusual in that, despite not being insectoid like many others on today's list, they were a true group mind. By themselves, a single Billar wasn't especially bright. However, what made this mammalian species unique was their ability to pool their consciousness, intelligence, and thoughts together and form a communal resource. These groups, made up of Billars who shared a special bond together, were known as a clacker. To give you an idea of scale, a single Billar was as smart as a wild animal. 2 Billars were as smart as a trained house pet. 4 achieved sentience, and any more than that only added extra points into their intelligence stat. At 7 members in the clucker, the group achieved genius level intellect, and anything above 10 was usually unheard of. The special bond that created the cluckers was formed shortly after birth, uniting Billar born close to one another. To create that group mind, the Billars relied on pheromones, telepathy, physical touch, and visual contact. Clackers usually spoke as one person and used just one name, no matter how many Billars were in there. However, this bond could be broken if an individual was separated from the group. The death of one member meant a deep mourning period for the rest, and sometimes led to the death of the entire clacker. To use a different reference in comparison, we imagine they're what Mousehold, the Pokemon, is supposed to be. In Mima 2's lush jungle, the Billars had little to worry about. Larger clackers urbanized on the more tectonically stable regions of the planet. They had some primitive industry, but it was of little interest to Offworlders. In fact, most Offworlders found interacting with the Billars deeply disturbing and avoided them as much as possible, which generally meant a peaceful existence for the little hairless folk. That's why, as a general rule, all Billars were laid back, focused more on chillaxing than on doing anything else. They were also pacifists and preferred running over staying to fight. Although they shared a few general traits, every clucker was unique and could change moods rapidly, which was yet another reason Offworlders didn't like interacting with them. Being herbivores, the Billars had to worry about local predators. Smaller, less intelligent clackers ran and hid from them, while larger, more intelligent clackers built traps and ensnared their enemies. Aside from their propensity of running away, they were very curious, very sociable creatures that obviously loved spending time with their own kind. Although we don't know a lot about any religious beliefs they might have had, many Billars believed in something called an Overmind, or what they thought a clacker connecting all Billars might be like. Of course, if a clacker could only be formed between Billars born minutes apart, it made sense they would sync their reproduction. Billars reproduced in a way that many were pregnant and due at the same time. Expectant mothers were kept in the same area so their infants could bond to one another to form their own clucker. There was a good reason these bonded units were so important to the Billars. As we mentioned earlier, a singular Billar wasn't intelligent, much less sentient. In their early days, thanks to their chill nature, Billars were sitting ducks for predators. Becoming highly social was a survival tactic at that time, as the groups provided safety from anything hunting them. Over time, they evolved from simply being group animals to a group mind, with bonds so strong they connected individuals into one person. This evolutionary trait proved incredible, as you can imagine, with the pooled intelligence forever transforming the species. Within a few generations, the Billars had evolved to promote this bonding, their reproductive cycles synced, and they became able to plan group births. With sentience came technology, as the Billars learned to use tools and lay traps for the predators. They soon became the dominant species in the jungle and never stopped developing. By the time of the Galactic Civil War, they had urbanized properly and had reached the point of their industrial revolution. Their first contact with Offworlders came between 3000 and 1000 BBY, at which point their homeworld, Mima 2, became part of the Dialgoth sector in the Mid-Rim. Later, during the Clone Wars, Mima 2 technically belonged to the Republic, though they didn't participate in the war. As a general rule, Billars didn't leave their homeworld. This was partially because they had everything they needed on Mima 2, and primarily because they hadn't invented spacefaring technology and had little to offer Offworlders as a trade. However, a few cluckers did make it off Mima, and they sought roles in various professions, fueled by their curiosity. They thrived in roles that took advantage of their group intellect, such as acrobatics groups, musicians, theatre performers, and so on. A few ventured into much shadier professions like slicing, assassination, gambling, and some became general crime lords. One such example was a clacker known by the name Uniyurudi, a group made up of 10 Billars. If you remember, a group this size was well above genius level intellect, so it's no surprise they achieved infamy as an interplanetary con artist. They owned multiple clubs in Cloud City, eventually becoming the richest persons in the sector. As for the other clackers, they usually traveled only for a short time. As we mentioned, non-Billars found them incredibly disconcerting, so Billars faced heavy discrimination out in the galaxy. For example, Elrod slang referred to them as Tictils, from the acronym TCTL, Too Cute to Live, which is certainly a mood. The next species we'll take a look at took the Billars' dream of a collective mind and made it a reality. The Tauril were a multi-limbed species from an unknown homeworld. Thanks to their small, furry bodies and the way they scurried about, many compared them to perceived vermin species such as womp rats. No one could really agree on whether they were non-sentient or semi-sentient, but the truth was that the Tauril were fully sentient thanks to the Tauril Overmind that controlled them. Each individual Tauril was little more than an extra pair of eyes for the Overmind, or limbs and organs for the Overmind to manipulate. The moment one Tauril saw something, others swarmed it to give multiple POVs that provided the Overmind with more information. Fueling the nightmare rat comparison, Tauril were small, about 1.2 meters in length. The Tauril's bodies were covered in grey-brown fur except for their arrow-shaped tail, the head, and their limbs. Their heads were shaped like a human's, except for the two large eyes that protruded out of the skull on eye stalks. They had 6 jagged limbs, 4 of which were arms. The other 2 were mostly used as legs, but in a pinch, they could also serve as arms. All 6 limbs were extremely malleable and durable. Like rats, they could squeeze their bodies through tight spaces in order to explore. Despite all this, Tauril weren't actually rodents. They were simians and resembled apes in many ways, such as the heads. The rest of their body resembled that of lice, which isn't a very fun mental image. Now, as we mentioned before, all Tauril were controlled by a single collective consciousness known as the Tauril Overmind. Despite there being thousands of Tauril bodies, there was only really one Tauril mind, with the individual bodies being insignificant parts of it. Xenoanthropologists describe this hive-mind type as eusocial. No singular Tauril body had independent thoughts or feelings, personalities, or even their own motivations. This is what led many to classify them as semi-sentient, even if the Overmind itself was classified as fully sentient. Force users trying to sense the Tauril's presences felt only blurry echoes of the Overmind. One of the Overmind's primary goals was information gathering. Scouting every corner of the galaxy, individual Tauril turned over every stone. From an outsider perspective, it looked as if individual Tauril were seeking out info for their personal reasons. Anything or anyone new would get swarmed, touched, licked, sniffed, and so on until the Tauril's curiosity had been appeased or someone had pushed them away. When they were swarming new things like this, it made many humanoids think of rats swarming food in sewers. later on, it was discovered that a Taural needed to be in proximity to others to receive instructions from the Overmind. If a Taural ever became separated from the rest of its kind, which was rare, it wouldn't suddenly achieve independence. Rather, its body would collapse and remain limp, as there was no brain to give it instructions to move without the Overmind's direction. In this sense, the Taural operated similarly to the B-1 battle droids back when they were solely dependent on a droid control ship. If not reunited with its kind, that Taural would simply lie there until it perished from starvation or dehydration. As we mentioned earlier, their homeworld is unknown, but the species had been documented during the later years of the Old Republic. At some point, a xenobiologist came across the Hive-Mind while working as a scout in the Outer Rim. The scientist then sold the information to Durga Basadi Tai, a young Hutt crime lord, who then killed the scientist and approached the Taural with a deal. In exchange for power and wealth, the Hutt wanted the Taural to become his intelligence gatherers. The Overmind, however, declined that offer, as it had no need for either. What it asked for instead was for the Hutt to scatter its members across the galaxy. Durga agreed and was given thousands of Taural, which he treated and trained as his pets. But Durga didn't stop there. In 12 ABY, the Hutt visited with Leia Organa Solo, then Chief of State of the New Republic. His visit was a cover. His true intent was to steal the plans to the first Death Star from within the Imperial Palace. With him, Durga brought 98 Taural that had been specifically trained on how to behave. Given how rare they were, Organa and the others were taken aback. During the visit, Durga gave the signal for the Taural to move out. Following orders, 2 Taural went for a guard. One of them crawled into the barrel of his ceremonial rifle, while the second pulled the trigger, killing the first, to everyone's shock. The shock seemed to scare the other Taural, who scattered, prompting a very concerned Durga to instruct the guards to catch them. To pacify their guest, the New Republic guards and Organa's C-3PO began tracking the Taural, which naturally took quite some time. In the orchestrated chaos, 3 Taural slipped through the cracks and made it to the Imperial Information Center in the lower levels of the palace, dodging several patrols. Upon accessing a computer terminal, they used the codes Durga had provided to access secret information, which they then downloaded into a data cylinder and hid in the fur of one body. Since they were all connected, the Overmind already knew of their success, so Durga was notified instantaneously through one of the other Taural he had with him. The Hutt's mission was successfully completed soon afterwards, and he departed Coruscant with most of his pets alive and the Death Star plans in hand. It didn't take long until the ploy was uncovered, however, and the New Republic realized what Durga had pulled off. In response, the New Republic sent a military team to deal with the Hutt. At the same time, Durga sent 2 of his allies, General Sulamar and Dr. Lemelisk, to build a new superweapon fashioned after the Death Star. Construction of the Darksaber, as it was titled, took place in the Hoth asteroid field, where Lemelisk developed the design and trained 2 Taural to build it. As absurd as this might sound, with 2 Taural knowing how to do it, all of them did, and so an army of Taural was out there in custom-made spacesuits building the newest Death Star. Of course, their natural curiosity was a hindrance. They worked well while they were focused, but anything new drew the attention of the swarm. After the attraction had been thoroughly inspected, they did return to work, but not to the precise task they had been working on before, which caused Lemelisk several headaches and chaos to ensue. Several key parts of the design were built incorrectly as a direct consequence, such as the computer core being connected to a thermal exhaust port. Lemelisk realized these disasters early on, but like any good project manager, he failed to report them to Durga. Instead, he doubled the Taural's work hours and tried to supervise them directly. In the end, thanks to the Taural's many mistakes, the superweapon turned out to be useless. The only way Lemelisk was able to keep schedule was by straight up lying on his reports until he eventually declared the project completed. The Taural laborers stopped work and moved into the Darksaber's empty rooms. Meanwhile, the New Republic's team infiltrated the new superweapon. One of its team members, General Crix Maydeen, was captured and brought before the Hutt on the bridge to be executed. The Taural were watching. Then, the Hutt, believing the superweapon to be ready, tried to use it to destroy an oncoming asteroid. As expected, it didn't work. The super weapon was promptly caught between two planetoids and crushed, killing everything on board, including the army of curious little critters. So far, we think we've done a pretty good job of establishing that, despite the stereotype of hive minds all being insectoid, Star Wars does a very good job of making the hive pool diverse. Our next entry takes that a step further into the bizarre. We're talking about the Tirith, perhaps one of the most unique species in the franchise. You see, the Tirith were a hive mind species, but not only were they not insectoid, they weren't mammalian either. Instead, these cute little guys were pure wisps of energy in gaseous form native to the planet Behemoth out in the Outer Rim. Behemoth was an incredibly inhospitable world due to how dry, arid and hot it was, but life always finds a way, and in the Tirith's case, life chose to skip material form altogether. Instead, they appeared as wisps of energy, forming little green clouds of vapor that glowed a soft green color. Much like the other hive mind species, they were connected to one another through empathetic bonds. Each Tirith was linked physically to its family group, sharing emotions and sensations like pain. Similar to the Billars, individuals could live on their own, but if a Tirith died, it could spell doom for any other Tirith it was linked to. But it wasn't just family groups that were connected. Tirith could form large hives, and when connected, their strength was boosted considerably. Tirith were capable of altering the chemical composition of Behemoth's atmosphere, which, by extension, means they could go as far as to create whatever weather patterns they wanted. Thanks to their gaseous form, the Tirith were pretty much immune to most forms of damage. However, strong vacuums, winds, or electrical currents were still a threat due to the nature of their incorporeal existence. They also lacked any real defense other than changing the chemical composition in the air to create a non-lethal gas that would knock potential enemies out. Later on, during the New Republic era, a small group mutated, evolving the ability to produce deadly toxins capable of granting their enemies a horrible death. Another extension of their gaseous form was that they were incapable of any vocalizations. Despite this, they could communicate telepathically both with others of their own kind and all other species. In fact, there was no language barrier, as any telepathic message the Tirith sent to an off-worlder was automatically translated into their native language. The species were also incredibly long-lived, with individuals capable of reaching 1,000 years of age. Scientists weren't clear if they lived in one megacolony numbering around 17 million, or if they were separated into thousands of smaller units. As a society, they were characterized by strong pacifism and reclusiveness. Due to their strong empathetic bonds, they could feel others' pain, and as a result, they could barely understand the concept of causing someone else harm. That said, their top priority was always the well-being of the hive. When their homeworld was colonized by Bothans and humans during the Republic era, both failed to notice the Tirith. As we mentioned, they were very reclusive, and so it's not surprising that they weren't fully discovered until 3 ABY. Until then, whenever someone saw a Tirith, they were thought to be just a passing cloud of chemicals. In 3 ABY, Gideon Longspar, the leader of a local gang known as the Brigands, was the first to realize the truth, that the Tirith weren't just gases, but living creatures. He captured a hive, hoping to use it in a scheme against local moisture farms. He isolated half of the hive, holding it hostage under threat of torture to coerce the remaining members to do his bidding. His goal was to steal every drop of water available, which put the human colonies at great risk. Eventually, they raided the moisture farm that belonged to Dariel Anglethorne, a leading figure in the farmers' defense efforts. Longspar took her captive, which irritated Anglethorne's friend, Jedi Knight Luke Skywalker. Skywalker came to her rescue, and with the help of Tirith, put an end to Longspar's band of brigands. In thanks, the Tirith banded together to create a major downpour, saving thousands from dying of thirst. Unfortunately, it wasn't the last time someone would try to take advantage of the pacifist wisps of energy. The next species we'll be talking about were not nearly as friendly and sweet-natured as the Tirith. We're talking, of course, about the Drengir, and if you're a fan of Legends, you might have heard of these twisted monstrosities. Native to the planet Mulita out in wild space, the Drengir were a plant-like species of sentient carnivores with aspirations of galactic infestation. They were said to have been born of pain, hatred, and darkness, with presences so twisted they could overwhelm anyone, even a Jedi. This was because, like some other beings in the galaxy, the Drengir were pure embodiments of the dark side, and they let everyone that met them know it. The center of their bodies was a massive maw surrounded by an array of teeth, with countless tentacles in variations of green and brown extending outward. Their tentacles could secrete a deadly poison, but that wasn't even their deadliest weapon. The worst they could do was casting a shadow, as it was called, where the Drengir's presence reached out toward other sentients, overwhelming them. Even plants near the Drengir were affected, curling away from it in an attempt to escape. Their presence was so noxious, the plants would be left tainted and blackened. Just like plants, the Drengir started off as seeds, and within a few days, they would grow to towering heights. To a Drengir, everything was food, and their only concern was sating their never-ending hunger. They would eat creatures like wampus whole, capture sentients, and strangle them with their tentacles by pushing them into their ears, eyes, nose, and mouth, or drain children's life force out of them. They were pure evil in nature and sought only to fill their bellies and spread chaos and pain. Even though they were intelligent, they lacked the scheming mindset, usually going with simple plans that were nevertheless devastating. Drengir were also blessed with potent healing capabilities. Weapons one might think would deal super effective damage, like blasters or lightsabers, couldn't leave lasting injuries since the Drengir could regenerate quickly. Even being cut in half by a lightsaber only resulted in there now being 2 Drengir. The only thing that seemed to truly kill them was exposing them to the vacuum of space. Perhaps surprisingly, they were capable of speaking Galactic Basic. They usually operated in groups as they were a hive-minded species and shared a collective mind. They often finished each other's sentences. Sometimes they would use their dark side influence to convince captives to join their collective presence. When seeking to hunt or expand, Drengir would target sentient settlements by lurking near them in the shadows. First, they would unsettle their unknowing prey by making frightening noises. Then, they would cast a blight that killed all the crops in the fields, leaving them blackened and dead. Those crops would then mold, secreting a nauseating stench. Meanwhile, the Drengir would set up a den nearby where it would lure the settlement's children to drain their life force. And finally, once it had consumed the children, it would attack and kill everyone in the settlement, leaving behind dark vines to mark the cursed landscape forever. As you can imagine, the history of the Drengir is long, sordid, and full of agony for everyone they came into contact with. Thousands of years before the Battle of Yavin, even before the Galactic Republic had explored much of the galaxy, the Amaxine warriors came across the Drengir on their homeworld. The Amaxine tried to combat them, but that backfired when the Drengir infiltrated their space station, eating many and forcing the rest to retreat. Later, the Sith discovered the same space station and put the Drengir on board in stasis. Eventually, during the High Republic era, the space station became a waypoint for Bine Guild pilots. In 232 BBY, a group of Jedi became stranded on the space station alongside other ships. The stranded began exploring the ancient station, but the Jedi began sensing a disturbance in the Force. Eventually, the Jedi hypothesized the source of the dark side presence was the 4 binding statues, and in a stroke of inspiration, they brought them to Coruscant only to discover the threat wasn't in the statues. The threat had been kept at bay by them. When they returned to the station to reposition the statues, however, they were ambushed and the Drengir were unleashed. Further investigation on Mulita saw the great progenitor awoken, and it was hungry. As if the galaxy wasn't dealing with enough at the time, now it had to deal with the Drengir and their plans to reap harvest, as they called it. Spreading across the galactic frontier, they began abducting children, capturing adults, and holding them underground, killing all the crops and generally destroying everything they could. A team of Jedi went to investigate, but many were overwhelmed by the Drengir's darkness. Despite their best efforts to rescue their own and many of the locals, they were eventually overwhelmed. Some escaped, but others became food for the Drengir, or one with its collective mind. Eventually, the Drengir's expansion across the galactic frontier was stopped when the Jedi Order launched an assault on Molita, the aliens' homeworld. The Jedi were aided by the Hutt cartel in their efforts, as both parties recognized they couldn't allow the Drengir to expand even more. The Jedi had learnt of the location of the Great Progenitor, the first of all Drengir, through a link in the Force with the creatures. With as many Jedi as possible, they attacked the Great Progenitor, and by taking it out, they stopped the Drengir threat. What they didn't know at the time was that the Nihil Marauders, a different group, had used the Drengir as a smokescreen. While many Jedi were preoccupied with ending the threat on Molita, they attacked the Republic world of Valo, heralding a new world of problems for the Republic. But that's a story for another day. But of course, a video on all Hive-Mind species in Star Wars wouldn't be complete without the OG Hive-Mind, the Killiks. As we're sure you all know already, Killiks were a sentient insectoid species that lived in units called nests whose members were all part of the collective mind. What some might not know is that, despite them all sharing a similar genetic code, there wasn't just one kind of Killik. They varied greatly from nest to nest, both in form and in function. Some Killiks could be smaller than a human, while others could be the size of starships. Each nest was unique, but all of its members shared the same genetic traits. That's not to say there weren't any overarching common characteristics. Every Killik had a strong chitinous exoskeleton. Along the exoskeleton were several porous openings known as spiracles through which the Killik breathed. Typically, the human-sized Killiks had 4 arms, each of which ended in a powerful 3-fingered claw. They also stood on 2 sturdy legs. There were several ways Killiks communicated with one another, many of which hit the tropes we've seen in other entries on this list. They relied on pheromones, electromagnetic transmissions, but also on long-range telepathy to stay in touch with one another. With this aura-style communication, Killiks in a nest were constantly sharing feedback with one another. Their pheromones didn't just affect Killiks either. If someone from another species was exposed to them, the pheromones could alter the basic structure of the victim's corpus callosum, aka the organ that connects the left and right hemispheres of the brain. These victims would then be able to receive signals from the Killiks, assimilating them into the Hive-Mind. These victims were known as joiners of Bugsluts, and over the millennia the Killiks had been alive, many had joined their ranks, some voluntarily, some not. Within the nest, Killiks served many different functions. Some were guards or builders, some assassins, some attendants or membrosia givers. Some scouted or infiltrated, some built mosaics. No matter what their profession, all started as small larvae that were born into the nest. Killik reproduction was similar to what you'd expect of bees. Most Killiks were female, while males were intentionally born only when a new nest needed to be created. Just one Killik could lay 1,000 eggs a month, and the larvae that hatched from those eggs would be battle ready in another year and sexually mature in 2. This allowed Killiks to reproduce extraordinarily fast, swelling their numbers when there were enough resources. As for their hive mind, it functioned very similarly to others we've discussed today. Thanks to their mental connection, the Killik nest was essentially one individual. Whether they were one of the kind, as they called themselves, or a joiner, each individual ceased to have independent thought, instead being one with the will of the nest. Whatever one individual learned, everyone in the hive knew. However, this didn't extend outside each nest. If 2 Killiks from different nests met, they had to communicate through language. The way Killik communication generally worked was through an individual's aura. As long as a Killik was within range of another, they were connected to the nest. This could mean a chain could extend outwards to extraordinary distances, which sometimes meant the hive could become confused. With information entering the collective pool from so many sources, it sometimes led to the mind confusing reality and beliefs. Due to their hive mind, it was difficult for Killiks to negotiate with non-Killiks or even understand other species' emphasis on individuality. In fact, they believed the galaxy would be better if individualistic species could put their personal issues aside and work for the good of the whole. That said, despite their lack of independent thought, the Killiks were still capable of creating beautiful works of art, such as mosaics that depicted their history. What seems more surprising is that, as their telepathy could extend to other species, Killiks were, by nature, peaceful beings. Like most insectoids, they had a strong drive to increase their numbers and territory. This led to other Killik nests being seen as competition for resources or a potential threat, which led to many wars between hives despite their overall peaceful natures. However, there was more than just the individual hives. There was also the colony, the collective of all the hives in an area. While the nests didn't communicate with one another in the same way, the colony was still seen as all Killik kind, and together they often took on external threats. And when the colony went to war, the individual nests, many of which specialized in different aspects of warfare, could wreak incredible devastation. The Kolosolok, for example, were known as heavy hitters, whereas the Abeya provided air support. The Gorog might be specialist field warriors, while the Wooloo played support roles. And naturally, a species with little value and individuality didn't care if one of their own went down. Of course, with millions working in harmony, the Killiks could do anything they wanted to. Their industry potential was essentially unlimited, and a few hives over the millennia could even harness the Force in their construction. Overall, the Killiks weren't Force sensitive, but a few individuals could possess a strong connection to the Force. Back when the Killiks had more access to it, they could do anything, from building space stations or moving through space without the use of technology. And all this, they did long before most other species had evolved to use technology. The Killiks were an ancient species dating back to the pre-Republic era, during which they shared a galaxy with such giants as the Celestials, the Gree, the Qua, the Sharu, and the Tong. Originally they were from Alderaan, which they called Ouroboros, but they soon spread across the stars to neighboring systems. Well before 35,000 BBY, the Celestials were the driving power in the galaxy, and seeing the Killiks' endless industrial potential, they exploited them as laborers. This was a period the Killiks referred to as the Great Migration, when some of their kind remained on Ouroboros, while others were scattered across the stars. Many were sent to the Polemian, where the son and daughter directed their hives on the various construction projects, one of which was believed to be Centerpoint Station. Other ancient wonders the Killiks witnessed was the creation of the Maw and of the Volta and Corellian systems. Now, something happened that upset the Celestials. Killik history isn't reliable, as we mentioned before, but according to the Killiks, the kind did something to incur the Celestials' wrath. As a response, the Celestials removed all Killik from their homeworld. By 30,000 BBY, the balance of power had shifted into the hands of the Rakata. At this time, the Killiks invaded Korriban, but were driven off by the pureblood Sith. After this, the Killiks vanished from the known galaxy, banished instead to the unknown regions. The Celestials are thought to have been responsible for this, but again, there's no reliable way to know. The only thing left behind were the hollowed out hives they had built. Much later, Luke Skywalker theorized that, after having consumed all the resources on Alderaan, the Killiks had tried to expand into the rest of the core. In response, the Celestials had banished them to the unknown regions to protect the rest of the galaxy. Out in deep space, the colony was forced to search for a new homeworld for the kind. However, they were unable to find a suitable planet to inhabit. Thus, the colony split into thousands of individual nests, each of which went their separate ways across the unknown regions, inevitably settling across a handful of worlds where they would remain for 30,000 years. It turned out, however, that not all Killiks had abandoned Alderaan. A few nests remained on the planet, hidden in hibernation deep underground, beneath the region known as the Castle Lands. Every few hundred years or so, these nests would emerge and clash with the humans who had colonized the world. The Alderaanians established the Order of Extermination, which was tasked with eliminating any Killiks that emerged. By the time of the Cold War, approximately around 3653 BBY, the hives reawakened. During the so-called era of peace, a brutal civil war had broken out between various houses of Alderaan as they each vied for the empty throne. House Ulgo, which was backed by the Sith Empire, used a facility known as the Pain Factory to control the Killiks and add them to his forces. Eventually though, Republic agents were able to destroy the machine, liberating the nests from Imperial control. The Sith Empire tried other ways to use the Killiks in their scientific experiments, but thankfully, none were successful in the long run. Meanwhile, the Killiks out in the unknown regions remained there in their own pocket of space until 0 ABY, when Alderaan was destroyed by the Death Star. Until then, the Killiks had been contained, with only a few inter-Hive wars. The reconnaissance corps of the Chiss expansionary defense fleet had been monitoring the Killiks for a long time. As the self-appointed enforcers of the unknown regions, the Chiss ascendancy kept many local threats in check. The Killiks, so far, hadn't been deemed an active threat. Due to a labour shortage that came as a result of the Third Vagari War, many Chiss families hired out Killik nests to do work for them, which was a perfect solution to their problem. The Chiss already knew about the risk of joiners becoming one with the colony and took due precautions, but in the end, these measures failed. Thanks to sabotage, most likely attributed to inter-family drama, 2 entire Chiss families became joiners and 3 more became critically dependent on the Killik workforce. This led to some understandable internal conflict within the Chiss ascendancy, which was detrimental for the entire region's stability. Later on, in 27 ABY, a starship named Taecheon Flyer crashed into Yogoi, one of the planets in the unknown region that had become a Killik colony world. From the crash, only 3 Force-sensitive humans survived: Raynar Thul, Lomi Plo, and Welk, the latter 2 of which were Dark Jedi. Despite making their way out of the burning wreckage, all 3 were severely wounded. The Killiks there found them and brought them back to their nest, where they helped them recuperate. Eventually, all 3 became joiners, and that was a problem. If you remember, when a joiner was assimilated into the Hive-Mind, the nest learned everything the joiner had known in life. Their memories became the Killiks' memories, and before this fateful flight through the unknown regions, Raynar Thul had fought in the Yuuzhan Vong War. With the 3 Force-sensitives' arrival, 2 things happened. The Killiks learnt of the Yuuzhan Vong War, of which they'd had no knowledge, and the Killiks became able to use the Force. Raynar Thul became known as Unu Thul, and Lomi and Welk became the leaders of what became known as the Dark Nest, or Gorog, a reclusive Killik hive. Since joining, Raynar brought many outside values to the Killiks. Usually when a joiner became one with the collective, their individuality was wiped out. In Raynar's case, it was the opposite. His joining the hive brought a sense of individuality and the value of one's life to the nest. Now in command of the Yogoi hive, Raynar made it his mission to help not just them, but the neighbouring hives. For this, he earned himself the title of Joiner King. He established a new nest known as the Unu Nest and established trade of food and equipment between the hives. There were a few minor incursions from other nests that didn't approve of this new way, but despite these setbacks, the nests Raynar was helping flourished. For the first time, the colony was united under one will, and its purpose was expansion. In 29 ABY, they established the first colony nests on the border with the Chiss ascendancy. During this expansion, the Killiks' population surged because, for the first time, they were actually treating their sick and injured. The Yogoi nest also survived an attack from a rival nest, either destroying it or absorbing it. The huge swell in numbers brought extreme food shortages with it, however, and the Killiks were forced to rely on interstellar trade to survive. Their population growth wasn't helped by the increasing number of joiners assimilating into the hive. In 35 ABY, the Killiks were rediscovered by the Galactic Alliance, still struggling with food and shortages. By then, the colony numbered 375 nests in total. The Dark Nest, however, was not included in that number. Most Killiks had no idea it existed, and that was a problem. Without the Killiks knowing, the Dark Nest was secretly manipulating them from the shadows, pushing them toward expanding into the Chiss ascendancy. The Chiss, naturally, took issue with this, and the resulting conflict got so heated the Galactic Alliance had to intervene. It was determined that one of the nests, Koribu, was too close to Chiss space, and its continued existence would lead to more conflicts between the Killiks and Chiss. A Jedi team that had accompanied the delegation managed to convince Thul that the reason the nests were becoming hostile was because the Killiks had accepted many Chiss as joiners, and thus the only way to avoid a war was by abandoning that area of space. Leia Organa offered up a newly discovered region of space that contained worlds rich in resources. These new worlds were located in the Utugetu Nebula and would be perfect homeworlds for the Killiks. Even better, they were near colony space. Despite how tempting an offer it was, the Killiks had to refuse, as they lacked the means to relocate a nest numbering into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. The Jedi eventually found a solution to the problem by offering the use of Hapan battle dragons, and with the signing of the Koribu Truce, the Killiks departed for the Utugetu Nebula worlds. The Paradise worlds, as they were known, consisted of Wateba and 13 other planets. In accordance with the truce, the Killiks settled these worlds instead of expanding into Chiss space. Unfortunately, however, there was a problem. Unbeknownst to the Killiks, Wateba and the other Paradise worlds had an ancient environmental defense system built in. We don't know the exact details of how it worked, but we do know that every time the planets were hit by the nova that had formed the nebula, both animal and plant life was wiped out. Within 2 years, however, the defense system was able to restore the plant life. On the surface, these worlds did seem like a utopia, but anytime the Killiks tried to interfere with the ecosystem, the planet attacked them, killing and destroying their structures with fizz, a substance made up of nanobots that broke down anything it came into contact with. Understandably, the Killiks believed the Jedi had betrayed them, sending them to these cursed worlds to be wiped out. This, however, wasn't the case. The Jedi hadn't known about the defense system. This was a ploy of the Dark Nest, which had also been using pirates to attack the Galactic Alliance ships and smuggle black membrosia into the galaxy, a substance that led to heavy addiction for any insectoid species. A year later, in 36 ABY, the Killiks abandoned their new homeworlds in the nebula aboard 14 Nest ships. With them flew the Nest ship of the Dark Nest. As part of their prep work for an invasion into Chiss space, the Killik fleet turned on the Galactic Alliance Victory-class Star Destroyer Admiral Akbar. This was the start of the Swarm War. The attack on the Star Destroyer sparked a war between the Galactic Alliance and the colony, as well as the many insectoid species that had allied themselves with the Killiks, such as the Fefzes and the Yamri. These insectoid species had become joiners early on, and now they were one with the Nests. Seemingly in an effort to prevent war, Knight Jason Solo attacked a Chiss vessel, hoping to lure the Chiss into attacking the Killiks preemptively. On one side, Supreme Commander Gilad Palaeon led the Alliance forces, and Grandmaster Luke Skywalker led the new Jedi Order. Despite a Killik coup on Thifera that deprived the Alliance of Bacta, the Swarm War resulted in an Alliance victory. In defeat, balance was restored in unknown space. The Chiss returned to their borders, and the Killiks returned to their original lands and peaceful state. Of course, no good tale of war ends without a Jedi war crime. Despite the Killiks ceding victory, the Jedi travelled to the Utugetu Nebula and collected as much fizz as they could, which they then seeded across more than half of the Killik colony's worlds. This, the Jedi believed, would prevent the colony from reforming, as anytime the Killiks began repopulating, the nanobots would cull their numbers. And on that pleasant note, we've covered all the known Hive-Mind species in the entirety of Star Wars. So how did we do? Did we guess correctly that you wouldn't know most of them? Did we miss any? Feel free to school us in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.